OK, now MPs are back in Parliament today after the week Whitsun break. And one of the big things that everyone is already talking about is next week's spending review. And there's an awful lot of numbers involved in that. But luckily, the BBC's Ros Atkins has been looking into this for a Panorama programme. It's out tonight. It's called Is Britain Broke? And we can speak to him now. To Ros, thanks very much for joining us. I suppose the question is, Ros, is Britain broke?
Hi, Vicky. Well, certainly the UK's public finances are under a lot of pressure. You've been talking about one of the reasons why, the increase in defence spending, and that's certainly an important factor, but it's not the whole story. And in this panorama, we've tried to explore some of the major pressures that are being exerted on the UK's public finances. Within the programme, we look at ageing population, for example. Back in 1948, in the decade when the modern welfare state was created, 11% of people in the country were 65 or over. It's almost double that now. And of course, there are many reasons to celebrate us all living longer, but there are costs there, in particular with relation to healthcare and social care. So that's one factor. Another is rising expectations, what we're looking for from the state. If you take areas such as healthcare, as new technology and new treatments become available, often our hope is that we can access them. And of course, that comes with costs too. Then we've also got the state of the UK economy. It's been on the receiving end of three major shocks in recent years: the 2008 global financial crisis, then the pandemic, then the war in Ukraine. And that's had a
Okay, we're just going to ignore the austerity that we did? We're just going to ignore the economic incompetence of the coalition government? Just going to ignore that, are we? It's just the global financial crisis, COVID in Ukraine, is it? And even then, like, all of the problems that the war in Ukraine caused were pretty short-lived. There was a supply chain shock for a bit, and then the economy recovered afterwards. Reality is that outside of 2008, which is the biggest economic shock to the country, the second biggest economic shock was the fact that we engaged in crackpot, insane, monetarist groupthink garbage for 9 years post-2008, when we should have been continuing our counter-cyclical stimulus to be able to reinvigorate the economy. Why do you think America has a pretty good economy at this point and ours is in the toilet? It's because they didn't just do austerity for no reason, in the same way that the UK did and a lot of countries in Europe did as well.
Multitude of different impacts on the economy. One I'd highlight is that we've had to borrow a lot of money to get through those crises, and our annual debt repayments now are over £100 billion a year. Just to put that in context, that's roughly double the defence budget. And then finally, I'd talk about the change in the welfare state. What it used to do and what it's doing today is quite different, and that also comes with a cost. Just one example on that: health-related benefits have increased close to 50% in the 5 years that followed the start of the pandemic. And when we put all of those things together, the defence spending you've been discussing, with the ageing population, rising expectations, the state of the UK economy, and the changing nature of the welfare state, all of that is useful to factor in as we consider the politics and the promises that you're covering on the show.
And actually, Ros, what strikes me is that we quite often talk about £9 billion, the headroom that Rachel Reeves might or might not have, arguments over one spending commitment or another, which might be a couple of billion. The scale of this is enormous, isn't it? Do you think politicians are being honest about that and about the trade-offs that there are?
Well, the scale of the challenges facing our public finances are enormous, and certainly you can find people who think that politicians need to be more direct with us. One of those people is Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I've been talking to him for Panorama.
One of my huge frustrations about last year's election campaign is that neither of the major parties were being honest about the trade-offs. They were claiming that they wouldn't have to have significant tax rises or spending cuts. We saw very quickly in the budget that that wasn't clear.
The most infuriating thing, right, is that I think that it is true that in the run-up to the election, people weren't being honest about the nature of where the public finances were. I don't think that is necessarily untrue. The issue, of course, is that the rhetoric and the framing of what the nation's economy was like at the time was really, really disingenuous. The most disingenuous thing that we kept hearing from politicians was, we have the highest tax burden we've had since the Second World War. which is frustrating for two reasons, right, in terms of framing. The first thing that's frustrating is that it is framed as though this is somehow unique to the previous government, that it was unique to the Conservatives that taxation had become so high. Now, first of all, the Tories did loads of tax cuts, like getting rid of the 50p rate in the pound. They cut things like the national insurance rate twice. The overall tax burden broadly was increasing due to fiscal drag overall and the necessity of increased spending, because try and frame this as though the increasing tax burden was somehow the fault of the government rather than the fault of the fact that, as has been pointed out earlier on just now, we have an ageing society, we have more old people than we've ever had. These people require social care, mental health care, physical health care, they require treating for loads of different things, negative externalities that you get when you become an older person, as well as having a huge pension bill, lest we forget about regular state expenditure, which is going to require a higher tax base. It's going to require more public funding every year, as our population gets older and older, especially as our birth rate drops off and we start to curtail migration as well. This is a reality of why taxes are going up. It's because we have an ageing society. And no one's admitting that this is the case, in that taxes go up because the society gets older. That's just a fundamental fact of the matter, is that when your society gets older, you have to increase overall taxation, right? The second thing that frustrates me about the highest tax burden since the Second World War framing is that it is implying that somehow we are unique in our high level of taxation. Because those same dynamics that have caused the tax burden to be high are shared amongst basically every single country in the global north, even with our highest taxes since the Second World War, we're still basically middle of the pack when you compare us to other European countries. People are getting angry about high levels of taxation without realising that actually we have shitty public services because we haven't raised taxes as high as other countries have to maintain better public services. So we are constantly getting ourselves into the position where huge swathes of the country are essentially saying, we shouldn't have to pay any more tax to fund public services. Somebody else can pay for it. Taxes are already too high. Also, I think we should maintain reasonably high levels of migration to ensure that taxes don't have to rise any more than they need to. And I think that if we're going to raise taxes, the best place we should definitely start is up the top with things such as wealth taxes and equalisation and capital gains taxes. The idea that this should be the only way in which that we raise taxes in this country to deal with the fact that our tax burden is still lower than social democracies in Europe that have better public service outcomes and better broader macroeconomic outcomes than we do is for the birds. We should be taxing the richest more, I agree. But I don't think that this means that, middle to high income earners shouldn't see an increase in PAYE income as well.
The government would say it is focused on the challenges the UK is facing, that it inherited a black hole in public finances and that its emphasis is on growth. And let's be clear, if the economy were to grow at a faster rate than it currently is, that would be incredibly helpful to the UK's public finances. But in and amongst all of the political debate about what to do next, we can be certain on one thing, Vicky, and it's that the equation that underpins our public finances has significantly changed. And as we assess all of the options for how the government spends money and where it spends money, it is really helpful to keep that in mind.
Sounds like a great watch, Ros. Just remind people where they can see it.
You can see it right now on BBC iPlayer, and you can see it on BBC One at 8 p.m. tonight.
Great, thank you so much for speaking to us. So we heard there from Paul Johnson saying that politicians just aren't being honest with the public about all of this.
Well, the point is, the reason why we've had a comprehensive funding review, and it's the first one for 17 years, is that we've gone through each budget line by line. It's like anybody managing a household, looking to see where savings can be made.
Oh my God. End this government, please. Please end this government. Have government representatives from the Labour Party going, it's like when you're adding up a household budget. It is fundamentally not like adding up a household budget.
What subscriptions can be cut? How can we live within the finances that we've got? But what we are trying to do, or want to do, is reinvest in our economy. And we're actually increasing capital expenditure by 1.3% a year. That's £70 billion per year. So that means we can invest money in things like infrastructure, schools, hospitals, where we need to grow our economy. And what we need to do is use that money effectively to create new jobs, which is why I welcome the defence.
Okay, so you are issuing bonds to be able to invest in infrastructure expenditure that will pay down dividends in the long run. So you're explaining that it actually is not like a household budget in the slightest, and that actually being a sovereign currency issuer that can issue bonds as well is actually nothing like a household budget and the way state finances work.
Spending review, because that at the very minimum would create 30,000 jobs at the very start of it. So we need British jobs in order to reinvest into our economy so that we can grow it. So it works hand in hand so that we rebuild our economy, because we have to face it. We have inherited something that's been completely broken. Whilst we talk about that £22 billion black hole, that was there. We've had to fix that, and now we're working on fixing our economy and rebuilding our infrastructure.
And are they being honest? I mean, I don't just mean the Labour government, but
I mean, the reality is that they should have raised taxes more. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but they ran on an election campaign saying we're going to specifically constrain huge amounts of levers that we have in terms of increasing taxable income for the government. And now they're having to cut things in the wrong places to try and fiddle some numbers around to find taxes in literally every other place in the economy.
all the governments we've had.
I think that politicians of all stripes are being dishonest about the financial predicament that we currently find ourselves in. The national debt is now absolutely enormous. We spent £20 billion in April over what was forecast borrowing. The deficit continues to tick up, and we're unwilling to make the ultimately difficult choices that have to be made to address that. We need to drastically reduce our welfare bill. The welfare state has expanded far beyond its original purpose of providing a safety net to the most vulnerable. Now, over half of people in Britain today are net recipients from the state.
Literally, she's still pushing the fucking Telegraph lie that this is somehow receiving money from the state rather than just the natural position that any economy with public services comes into, where half of the people, either top half of the income, contribute more than they receive in state provision, because this is not money, this is provision, i.e. public services that are being spent on. Well, the bottom half, you pay less tax, right? What she's saying here is that we have a progressive tax system and that's a bad thing. Of course more than half do. It's because we have a progressive tax system. That is basically entirely how a macroeconomy functions. Why you're saying this as if it's somehow ridiculous is insane to me.
Simply unsustainable. And as Ross says, we do have worsening demographics. Our worker to grey ratio is going down and down. There will be fewer people who are able to support the welfare state, who are able to support the NHS going forward. And Labour may say that they inherited a broken economy, and I do have some sympathy with that position, but they seem to be taking a sledgehammer to any of the functioning parts that were able to survive over the 14 years of Conservative governance.
And Josh, I saw you shaking your head at one point.
Yeah, look, I think there's a certain irreality going on across the political debate in this country. We broadly have, we shouldn't forget, we are the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world. This idea that we're broke and we haven't got any money, we've got huge pockets of wealth across the country as well. We are not a poor nation, we're not on our knees. What we don't have, unfortunately, is the same levels of tax in this country that they have in Scandinavia, in France, in Germany, in the fastest growing economy in Europe at the moment, Spain. We tax less, and yet we talk about this tax burden like it's some uniquely high thing in the UK, and actually all Western European nations are facing the same thing, which is an ageing population, as Ros said, which does put extra pressure on social care, on the NHS, and on the state pension. Now, we have a relatively ungenerous state pension in this country. It's far lower than in most other European countries. We have more people claiming it, which is why the welfare bill has gone up. We have more people working longer because we have a higher retirement age than many places in Europe as well, which means more people get to a certain point in their life and are off sick with disabilities and so on. And that's why, partly, why that has gone up as well. There's also a mental health crisis. We see the waiting list for the NHS, both for physical health and mental health. And that has a knock-on effect on the welfare.
And that's the thing, right? It's super important, the point he's making here, which is that there are always negative externalities for cutting state expenditure. The experiment of crazy crackpot austerity from 2010 to 2019 is patient zero for a load of social problems that have had knock-on economic downsides all of these years later, not just in terms of the overall NHS capacity being lower, making people worse off holistically, that's also made them less economically productive as well. It's not increased any kind of private investment to replace public investment that was being crowding out of the private sector, because that wasn't true. That wasn't true in the slightest. And all it's done is allowed whatever cracks there were in society that have made the economy less stable to propagate further, and to be enlarged by the fact that we didn't have any kind of safety net left to be able to catch people who fell through the cracks. It's as simple as that. Takato says we can't afford not to spend. 100%, absolutely right, Set the Shallow. I think the reality is that of course we need to tax the rich. Of course we need to tax the economically inactive, i.e. landlords, rentiers, people who live off of capital and passive income, right? We need to tax these people, but we also should be raising levels of income tax as well.
So if you invest in the NHS and get some of those waiting lists down, you will actually save on the benefits bill as well. But look, be serious. Do we want to live in a world where we have record levels of children living in poverty, record numbers of families in temporary accommodation, or do we want to invest in those things, which creates jobs if you're building housing? Unfortunately, at the moment, we have a situation where our welfare state is propping up private landlords because we haven't built council housing.
So what's
the
answer? What would you be in favour of?
I think one of the
wealth tax?
biggest things, well, there are a number of options for raising. I mean, wealth tax covers a range of things rather than just a sort of one-off, let's grab some money off the rich people. But, you know, which I'm not necessarily against, but I think there are more effective ways to do it and get regular income. Just equalising capital gains tax with income tax. It's ridiculous that people who go out and work pay a higher rate of tax than people who, you know, speculate on the stock exchange or sell houses and so on.
Well, except for the fact that those people are speculating with income which has already been taxed at the higher rate.
Well, yeah, but we all, you know, I go out and buy things in the shops and I pay VAT on that, and that's income that's already been taxed. We all pay tax. I pay my council tax and that's already been taxed out.
This is the worst thing. I hate the line that rightoids always come out with, oh, that's double taxation. Money gets taxed every single time it goes through some kind of transaction. 90% of the time there is a new tax when the transaction happens. The idea that somehow the money that they're speculating, gambling on the stock market, is somehow more precious from additional taxation than, as Andrew points out, money that is spent in the real economy through things like VAT or in terms of national insurance paid on the wages, which you spending in the shop goes to pay the wages of workers, right? All of this is double taxation in the same realm. But they only ever apply that standard when it comes to taxing investment income, when it comes to taxing people who make their money from money, rather than people who make their money from selling their labour for a wage. People wouldn't mind paying higher taxes if they were getting something for them. Now we pay taxes and it funnels to corporate welfare instead of public services. I mean, that is true. That is true, Boysdale. I don't think you're incorrect there. There is this self-fulfilling prophecy where we do corporate welfare and privatisation and private sector subcontraction and endless spending on consultants and corporate welfare, as you say. So people think, why should I get taxed to pay for this? So they want taxes to be lower, which means that the government justifies more outsourcing and privatisation, which means people think that the public sector is doing worse, they want to pay even less tax from there. And there's a vicious cycle, right? Whereas you've just had one reformist government that came in, got rid of private sector subcontraction, got rid of corporate welfare, got rid of consultancy overspend, and poured that money into actually publicly owned services and companies and things that are there for the public good, and then said, right, we've sorted out all of the private sector problems that we've got. Let's build a better public sector through increased investment and increased expenditure on things like salaries. That means you're going to have to pay more tax, but it's going to go back to you in the forms of service provision. People would not have a problem at all. But there is a self-fulfilling prophecy when we have public sector that is so beholden to private interests, which is, of course, what neoliberalism gave us. Even if Labour broke their promises, nobody would give a shit if this NHS started working and rent stopped rising so much and wages rose. I agree, Set the Shallow. The IPPR did a report on this, showing that most people would perceive Labour to have failed only if it didn't fix the NHS and public services, and that was more important to them than whether or not they kept their promise on overall taxation. Well, I do agree that we do need to build council housing, and we can build them with borrowing, but that shouldn't necessarily be the only way that we fund it.
of my income. So it's not the same.
But
Everyone
it would
pays
also
multiple
disincentivise
taxes.
people from investing in businesses.
But they're not
particularly
investing in
smaller
businesses, they're
companies that need that
speculating a lot of the
investment in order
time.
to grow, in order to create
They're
wealth,
not.
in order to
Most
create
small
jobs.
businesses get their money from banks, not from random investors
But I'm
speculating
afraid the
on the
fact
stock
is
exchange.
that in the
So
October
it's not true.
budget, Rachel Reeves increased taxes by £40 billion,
Yes.
which was the largest single
And I
increase
disagree,
in
by the way,
fiscal
with where she
statement
put those
for
taxes, but
decades.
that's not the point.
And yet
She should have raised taxes higher. She literally could have raised taxes higher. And again, he is right. When people start up small businesses, it's not random angel investors. It's not Duncan Bannatyne coming in like it's fucking Dragon's Den to build up a small business. No, they get a loan from a bank. Why we are expecting to not tax whatever profits the bank makes back from equity on the loans that they give out to small businesses, it's crazy talk. In fact, the banks have been so shit back the money in savings returns. Now interest rates have risen. They should be taxing them even more. We need to have the bank levy be higher than it currently is.
in April, as I said earlier, she was forced to borrow £20 billion.
Well,
if
yes,
the
of course,
government
because they've
cannot
inherited a very
have
weak economy,
healthier,
but-
have the public finances in ruder health after a £40 billion tax increase, how can the solution possibly be
You cannot
to
solve.
increase taxes
I mean,
any further?
as Ross said,
Because we don't have enough taxation as it is currently, Annabelle. When we are compared to countries with better public sectors, more growth, and a happier population. Because at the end of the day, right, all of this shouldn't be about numbers on a screen. It's about people. It's about the reality of living in the country. A country in which everyone on this panel is bemoaning the idea that people don't have enough societal buy-in to the country to want to defend it if we got attacked. So if we want to create a society with happier people who care about society, who feel buy-in to the country and the national project, whatever that might be, we're going to want to have a functioning public sector that is seen to have those people's interests at heart. And if we want to do that, we're going to want to have at least somewhat of a tax base that is similar to the countries that have that level of social cohesion in the European continent, that function better, that have happier people, higher standards of living, and yes, also have higher growth.
we have had multiple shocks since the banking crisis in 2008. The idea that one budget in 2024, with the greatest of sympathy to Rachel Reeves, who I'm not always sympathetic about, that could have solved 14 or 15 years, in fact 17 years since the banking crash, of kind of underinvestment in public services, weak economy, low growth, years of low growth we've had in this country. It's just kind of fanciful. And we do need to put more money into the NHS. We have put more money into the NHS, but it will take time to see the results of that. It takes time to train personnel. It takes time to get the waiting list down.
Well,
So-
Let's just bring in...
And even then, it's really important to point out, going back to what Annabelle said in the previous segment, where she's talking about we wanting increasing productivity, and she pointed out that we wanted lower tax and deregulation, right? We tried all of the things that she specifically would want, lower taxes and more deregulation, and it did not increase productivity. And in fact, when her favourite party, the Conservatives, were in power, we had the longest period of productivity stagnation in the UK modern history. So her ideas are proven not to work. And the company that she used to work for, the think tank, the IEA, when they had their own fiscal credibility tested, when they advised Liz Truss to do the fated fiscal event, we saw the biggest backlash to a government economic policy ever in terms of popular polling. We had a prime minister who was less popular than Vladimir Putin. So I don't think that she has any credibility, as well as the fact that I've already debunked how shit her idea is anyway. $4.99 from Graham Turner, nationalise the banks? Yeah, I agree, which is stupid given that we just sold off our last of our shares in NatWest at a £10 billion overall loss when those RBS shares were originally purchased, when they were generating revenue. We were getting equity from our state ownership of RBS, and Osborne before and Reeves now all continued to sell those shares back into the private market when they were generating revenue for the state. Why is that every single time we privatise the gains and socialise the losses in this country? It's madness. It is absolute, unmitigated madness that we continue to do this.
Let's just bring in Andrew Bowie here. Where's your party in all of this? A smaller state? Are you still in favour of a smaller
Yeah,
state?
absolutely. And we went into the last election with fully costed plans to reduce the size.
You didn't reduce the size of the state when you were in power.
Well, we saw.
No! This is the public broadcaster. She's the public broadcaster, representative, the fucking supposedly neutral chair of this panel. And she's going, well, you didn't decrease the size of the state. They fucking flogged off loads of shit from the state. These are the ones who sold off Royal Mail at bargain basement prices. Introduced even more privatisation into places like the NHS. As I just pointed out, sold off the remaining shares that we owned in Royal Bank of Scotland. What have they nationalised since 2010? A couple of rail franchises, maybe? That's basically it. How does the supposedly neutral chairperson get to just spread such nonsense about the idea that they've not shrunk the size of the state when they clearly have done? The overall tax burden is increasing, but they haven't actually changed the shape of the macroeconomy to be more state-led, have they? They were the austerity government for 9 years, and potentially 2 of them after Boris Johnson was deposed, right? We had the Johnson interregnum, where we had some real kind of more social democratic welfare state expenditure, for example. The idea that there should be an increase of healthcare spending during the Johnson interregnum, because he wasn't really a conservative. He was a big state nationalist liberal, right? Outside of that, they just did endless austerity and cuts. As Jack Mellor points out very well in chat, right? We had to sell off £15 billion of public assets from local councils just to pay for the lack of central funding to local authorities due to austerity cuts made by the Conservatives. And she's out here impugning them for not shrinking the state? What the fuck is this? What is this editorialising?
An exponential growth in the size of the civil service as a direct result of the COVID pandemic, and we had plans to reduce the size of that state, something that has not happened under the Labour government. In fact, we've seen it continue to grow over the past year. The fact is, talk about low growth, yes, absolutely. We have had low growth in this country for far too long, but when we left office, we did actually have the fastest growing economy in the G7, something that has...
What have you reduced? And Labour are now trying to means test the winter fuel allowance, for example, and you're against that.
Well, they reduced everything. They binned off Sure Start. They sold off Royal Mail. They did the Lansley reforms. They flogged off bits of the NHS into privatised public sector contracts, right? They slashed the welfare state. They slashed housing benefit. They slashed EMA. They replaced DLA and with PIP. They did the whole rollout of universal credit. They increased pension spending, right? They introduced the triple lock potentially, but they cut the block grants to councils. Councils had to sell off assets to be able to cover the cost. Like, all they did was slash. What the hell are you talking about? What is this? I mean, free money for the banks as a bailout is a bad thing. Nationalising Royal Bank of Scotland and, of course, Northern Rock for free were both good things that they did. I'm saying that it's bad that the neoliberal Labour government, with Darling as Chancellor, did not nationalise more banks. I think they should have nationalised more of them, rather than give them free money. Because at least under Obama, they were given loans they had to pay back, whereas there was a lot of free money through stimulus that was given to the banks outside of the ones that were nationalised, you know? We should have done more nationalisations there rather than giving them free money, essentially. I would agree with you there. But I think the one bright light, I guess the one silver lining of the way in which that Darling responded to the financial crisis was the nationalisation of RBS and Northern Rock. And the fact that Tory governments and red Tory governments afterwards decided to sell off those public sector gains was madness, because it was just a massive loss for the state.
Well, we're against taking the winter fuel allowance off of some of the most vulnerable pensioners in the country, it being the first announcement of this Labour government, with no thought given as to how those vulnerable people would be protected and kept warm through the winter. So, I mean, yes, of course we're against that policy.
What would you cut now if you were in power?
Well, the fact is we're many years away from the next election. We're not going to set out our plans just now. But in the last election,
you can't say I want a smaller state and not say how.
I'll tell you what we wouldn't have done. We wouldn't introduce Labour's jobs tax, which is resulting in many people becoming unemployed and some companies having to shut their doors, which will obviously have a knock-on effect on the welfare state as more people go to seek unemployment allowance. We've seen growth halved as a direct result, the IMF said, as a direct result of some of the decisions taken in the budget by Rachel
So that's
Reeves.
A tax cut. That's not reducing the size of the state.
But we said we would reduce the size of the civil service if we were
so
lucky
civil
enough
servants
to be
would...
Well, the civil services now is...
They can't even find a thing they want to cut from the state, because there's basically nothing left. There are redistributive policies, but in terms of public ownership, there's nothing. We have the NHS and we have education and the military, right?
number of people working within government, I think, ever.
And I think Labour does have plans to cut that.
They do, and we look forward to seeing those plans come to fruition, but there's no evidence that that is happening thus far. So look, we need to reduce the size of the state, we need to reduce the cost of government, we need to take drastic action to address the burgeoning welfare state crisis that we've got on our hands right now. Again, we had plans in our manifesto to do just that in a way that...
Yeah, again, they want to solve the problems of the welfare state by removing the welfare state rather than removing or fixing the issues that created the high level of welfare expenditure in the first place.
Wasn't the back of a fag packet plans that unravelled within a week of the Labour Party producing them just before the recess just gone. So I do have concerns that the economy is being affected, yes, by international factors, Trump tariffs, crises overseas, but actually more as a direct result of some of the anti-business, anti-growth policies that are coming out of the Treasury right now. They're actually doing more harm than actually would have otherwise been the case.
Joe, on welfare, where do you...
Literally, you increase one tax on the businesses, and suddenly you become anti-business, right? Now, I'm proudly anti-business. I can give a shit what business bedends think, right? But the fact that we can have, under the Conservative government, for example, endless fiscal drag, right? Them claiming to be a party of low tax, but instituting fiscal drag for all of that period, you know? And again, with perfectly good reason to do so. Perfectly good reasons to do so, because again, we do have plenty more in terms of state expenditure that's necessary, given the ageing population, right? But they essentially had to lie to the public by omission by using fiscal drag to pay for it rather than anything else. No one ever harangued them for personal taxation, right? But you come in and you raise one singular tax on businesses and immediately become the anti-business chancellor.
You stand on that? Do you think we should be reducing the welfare budget? That is forecast to rise an awful lot, isn't it?
I agree. We don't have a choice.
And how do you do that? That's always the question, isn't it?
For me, it is about enabling people back into work. It's working with...
And again, we already have one of the most punitive and least generous welfare systems in Europe. It is constantly failing the country and again, putting people more likely to be in long-term unemployment because the welfare state is so mean. It doesn't give people the framework or the resources they need to help them back into work in the first place.
Employers, so that there can be adjustments in the workplace. So there's also changing the law so there's a right to try, so people can be eased into work. And we need to ensure that people are putting a wage on the table, because I think that actually lifts aspirations and raises opportunities and creates that change in communities where poverty is extremely low, far too low. And so for me, I think the government is taking the right step. Those people who are long-term ill or never work because of their disability have to be protected within that system, but the focus has to be on people committing and contributing to the economy.
But there's lots of your colleagues, particularly when it comes to child poverty, who think that a Labour government needs to be doing more. And of course, one of the things that they think that should be done is that you should scrap the 2 child benefit cap, where there is a restriction on families claiming welfare if they have more than 2 children. Andy Burnham last night, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, said that on BBC's Westminster Hour. What do you think?
And again, I hate this whole discussion. I hate because this whole discussion has been about the idea that welfare spending is unaffordable. No one's challenged this basic premise. No one's challenged the entire premise of the whole discussion, which is the idea that somehow the welfare state is unaffordable. And I'm like, what's the biggest increase that we've seen in terms of welfare expenditure? It's the fucking state pension. The state pension is the most quote-unquote unaffordable part of the welfare state, and yet no one is suggesting we cut it. It's just which disabled person or workless person or someone who's underpaid, where should we cut their welfare? Gilded pensions, which aren't even that gilded because they're not particularly high in terms of international figures, but then again we have an entirely funded state pension rather than like a pension insurance model that we have in other European countries. Either way, that is somehow the sacred cow that must never be slaughtered. Not that I say that it should be, but even in the discussion where we kind of accept prima facie that welfare must be cut, we never even look at the thing which is the biggest expenditure. I don't think we should cut it. I don't think we should cut the welfare state. The welfare state is a good thing. We should be increasing taxes to be able to ensure that we can maximise the level of welfare spending that we have access to.
View is that I'm quite comfortable with the cap remaining. I feel that we need to support those children in poverty in many, many different ways.
Apart from, of course, the one way that would take them out of poverty. Like, people in chat who don't know about Magic the Gathering are not going to get this, but I'm going to make a Magic the Gathering reference anyway. So, in the 90s, there was a very famous strategy in Magic the Gathering called Necropotence, which was based around the namesake card Necropotence, right? Which was a very, very powerful card that warped the way in which the game was played, that was printed in the mid-90s, right? And for years and years, it was always one of the best things that you could be playing in the game, was some kind of strategy around this one card called Necropotence. And the people who managed Magic the Gathering, for the entirety of this period, kept banning cards from the format that were good with Necropotence, in the idea that if you just banned around the card, then something else would still be good. Of course, that never happened, and the Necropotence decks were still always the best decks. And I feel like it's going to become a point when they realise that Necropotence should have been banned, and they did ban it after all the years of trying to ban around it, and there was years and years of wasted time when people couldn't have been doing anything else with that period. It's exactly about how the Labour Party approached the 2-child cap on universal credit, in that they continually try and look for strategies around abolishing the cap, only to realise that all of those problems are ancillary to the fact that the cap should have gone in the first place anyway. See you later, Jack. Take care.
Lifting out of poverty is a phrase that we all use, but it's structural change that makes that difference, and it's enabling that they get access to good education, good healthcare, and that their families are assisted in working rather than being long-term.
So the way out of poverty is for those families to work. Yes. Andrew, where are you on that argument?
Well,
Andy Burnham saying one thing, Jim saying another.
It's simply not true to say the way out of poverty is to work, because 2/3 of children living in poverty in this country are in households where somebody works. So you have to tackle low pay, you have to tackle insecure work as well, which I'm not saying Joe is opposed to either, by the way. You have to tackle things like 0 hours contracts, which, to be fair, Labour's employment rights bill does, hopefully. When it's implemented, and you have to boost wages. We have incredibly low levels of pay in this country, and incredible proportions of people in low-paying sectors of the economy, and boosting that is through investment in various ways. You also have to boost the training budget, which of course was slashed over the last 15 years, because you can't create jobs if you haven't got the trained people to fill them, which is why we then have higher levels of migration. And again, there's a kind of unreality.
There is a problem as well, though, I said, with the graduate premium. Again, the fault of austerity, and we should have been doing full employment policy, and we haven't been doing that. We continually just cut, and that didn't lead to positive economic growth and positive productivity in this country throughout the period of austerity, right? This has been a cyclical problem. We have a gutting of the graduate premium because of a lack of investment, because there's been no consumptive power in the country to try and drive that level of investment, because we've been obsessed with supply-side economics rather than demand-side policy. And so people out there who are getting educated, who are getting degrees, who are out there trying to make themselves fit for the workforce, aren't finding high-quality, high-paid jobs for them to go into, because we gutted the graduate premium because of lack of investment, right? Which creates a cyclical problem where people don't have good jobs, people can't spend enough money in terms of demand, then it means that there's no incentive for people to come and invest to take advantage of that high consumptive power. So we have this doom loop, which is only going to get stopped by a proper level of investment in the country.
Reality about the way politicians talk about migration. If we've got a larger, I think Annabelle referred to it as, the grey mass of, kind of people who are retired, then one way to rebalance that is to have higher levels of migration, people working in this country, paying taxes, in order to rebalance
well, we've tried that
balance
already,
between workers.
And it's ultimately a Ponzi scheme. The problem is that it hasn't worked. Immigrants themselves not only age and are therefore a drain on public services, just in the same way as people who were born in Britain would be, but they also very quickly adapt to the native birth rate. So it's not as though those coming...
I mean, you're right that we need to fix the birth rate long term. I don't disagree with the idea that the birth rate needs being fixed long term, regardless of immigrant background or not. I certainly agree with the point that she's making, but in the short term, having had a low birth rate for a long time, we'll need to have migration to be able to fix those shortfalls that we've already created. We can't just have a glut where we've had a long period of low births, and glut will continue to be the dominant demographic of the country that's in work, right? We have to fix that through migration quickly, even whilst we try and build up the birth rate elsewhere. So I sympathise with the argument, but we do need to have migration in the short term to make up for the fact that we haven't had a high enough birth rate for quite a while now. But of course, migrants are not people who have had the state expend on things like school. Migrants who come here as adults haven't lived here as children, who are unilaterally drained on public finances because they are completely unproductive, right?
From countries that might have a higher fertility rate than our own will come here and have lots of children who could be the taxpayers of the future.
So Nigel
It's already
Farage,
proven not to work.
Reform
I'm just going to pick up.
say that they you can encourage people to have more children by reversing the two-child benefit cap. Do you agree with that?
I'm highly sceptical. I think that the two-child benefit cap should remain in place. One reason where
I mean, the reality is that whether you keep the cap or not, birth rates don't change. There are studies have shown that whether you have the two-child benefit cap or not, there hasn't been an effect since the institution of the cap on overall levels of fertility rates in this country. It has not proven to be this policy that stops people having kids they can't afford, quote unquote. That's not what it's done. So if we got rid of it, that wouldn't necessarily help increase the birth rate either. Is high migration just a neoliberal play? Long-term need a strategy to boost birth rates and increase training rates? I think we need to do all three. But what high migration, as you point out, has done has been a sop for the fact that our birth rate has been low due to poor state policy in the short term as well. So I think that this argument that high migration is just there to try and kneecap the bargaining power of workers by increasing the supply is a faulty one, because migrants also increase demand as well as supply. Therefore, it evens out and it's kind of a wash in the regard of their impacts on the labour market outside of certain sectors. But broadly, it's been an excuse to not invest in the public sector, I think. So you're probably right in that regard. But when it comes to the two-child benefit cap, it shouldn't remain in place. It shouldn't remain in place because it puts kids into poverty, and that's bad. Kids being in poverty is bad, and it is a stain. It's a shame on our nation that we have so many kids in poverty, especially those when families are working. Absolutely insane that's the state of this country at this point.
I agree with Andrew is that it doesn't address the root causes of poverty, unemployment, low wages, family breakdown. Another is I don't really see why families who've decided not to have more children because they can't afford to do so should, through their taxes, be forced to subsidise those who don't take them.
Because the kids are going to be fucking born anyway, and all that happens is it makes the kids more sick. It makes them more likely to be in poverty, more likely to starve, and they will be a future burden on the taxpayers, even if you want to look at it in your weirdo, dispassionate, completely devoid of humanity analysis of this, right? Even if you want to remove all humanity from your analysis, and you just want a dispassionate view of the economic results of such a policy, they will be a longer tax burden in the long run if they grow up in poverty. So why not just solve it now by actually ensuring that they don't go into poverty in the first place by getting rid of the two-child benefit cap? But of course they don't care about these. All they care is about moralising at people and starving children to punish parents. These people are sick. These people are just sick in the head.
The responsible decision to stop at having two children. And I'm just going to pick up on one point you made, Andrew, if I can.
That's not
on
a really
zero-hours
fair thing to say.
contracts, the vast majority of people who are working in things like the gig economy favour flexibility over having the secure work that you talk about. Of course, there will be instances.
When she says labour market flexibility, she means shit. She means shit. That's what she means. When she says labour market flexibility, she means worse wages, more power for bosses over workers, right? And worse terms and conditions. These are all bad things. And again, countries in Europe have continually had better workers' rights, a quote-unquote less flexible labour market, and have always had higher wage growth than we have, and higher productivity as well, and happier populations and higher aggregate growth as well. The idea that somehow continuing this crackpot experiment in ruining the working conditions of our working people in this country and kneecapping trade unions has anything to do with making us a better place to do business has to be disproven by the fact that's been the modus operandi of governments and labour market policy for the past 15 years and has got us nothing but economic sclerosis and stalled productivity for the entirety of that period.
Of unscrupulous employers who are exploiting workers, but the vast majority of those people are actually very happy with the work that they're doing, and that's what all of the surveys that I've seen said. And just to the wider discussion, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again, expecting different results. We have had a high tax, high spend economy for high tax.
She's crazy. She's literally crazy. She's looking at our tax burden, which is still in like the mid-range in terms of European countries who all spend way more than we do on public services, right? And trying to claim that we're somehow like this sclerotic social democratic country rather than a fucking neoliberal disaster capitalist hellscape. She lives in fantasy. She lives in a literal, totally fantasy world. She lives in a world of pure fantasy. Like, we have been trying the same thing for 46 years in this country, which is disaster capitalism, Thatcherism, and that's what we should be stopping doing. That's what we should be moving away from, is her ideology that we've had as economic groupthink in this country for 46 years, and it's all failed. Everything has failed.
High spend economy for years now. We have been on an upward trajectory such that taxes are to reach the highest level in 7 decades at the end of this decade, and we seem to believe
all the same lies I was impugning at the start of the programme. All the same lies where she was talking about the fact that we've had high tax burden since the Second World War just because governments wanted to tax more, rather than the reality of an ageing population. Just, God, these people are despicable.
Believe that the solution is just to tax people more and to pour that money into the public sector. It simply isn't working. To the NHS, you know, real-term spending increased by 2% on average over the years that the Conservatives were in government, and the NHS has got 7 million.
And in terms of GDP, it went down. In terms of percentage GDP expenditure, it was the longest drop in NHS funding since the establishment of the healthcare service. Again, she's talking in nominal terms rather than as a percentage of GDP. If she was doing it as a percentage of GDP, she would have seen that we kept dropping our NHS expenditure until the pandemic. It was only when the pandemic hit that we actually increased it significantly. And that means we had to deal with all of the negative externalities of that defunding of the NHS from 2010 till 2020, from the austerity nonsense that was being pushed by the coalition government, which was then picked up by Theresa May. So we had to expend more money to solve all of those problems of underinvestment for all of those 9 years, and then had to deal with all of the other problems that the pandemic caused on top because we had no resilience to a potential pandemic because I was all beaten out of the NHS by George Osborne's cuts. Just, again, a completely inverted reality that she lives in.
People on the backlog. Yes. How can we possibly believe that the answer to this is just to tax people more in order to pour more into that money pit? In fact, what we need to do is have a very difficult discussion about how we might change the funding model of the NHS such that it can replicate.
We'll do that another day. We'll do that another day.
But in Europe,
to get back to the outcomes, to get back to the welfare budget, Jo, are you content that we're in a situation?
Literally, she's not even being challenged on the fucking nonsense she's saying. Like, literally moving on to, oh, well, let's just bash welfare claimants again. Let's just talk about how the welfare useless eaters are ruining the country. Let's not allow somebody who actually knows what they're talking about to debunk the absolute dross that she's being allowed to spout with no pushback at all. Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. God, it's almost like I want Joe Coburn back.
It seems where the Prime Minister seems to be reversing his thought on means testing the winter fuel allowance. So there will inevitably, if he does that, probably be pensioners who are pretty well off who will get that. And then at the same time, you have a 2-child benefit cap.
It's a dilemma, but the thing is about the winter fuel allowance, it became universal, apart from the people who were on the lowest levels of income. And my view is it should be raised. And I very much support his announcement week before last. We were elected on the promise that we'd look after pensioners, and sadly, in my view, it's a decision that came too far and too fast, and so I welcome the shift.
So
I mean, here she is going, well, we can't take the money away from the pensioners, but we must keep the 2-child benefit cap. Just, I hate these people. I hate them. I hate them so much, right? I really do hate them. Just endless pandering to the wrinkly demographic, which, you know, I disagree with the means test as well, but at least I'm not trying to do that whilst trying to keep the 2-child welfare cap as well, right? Just shows you exactly the same priorities from an entirely uniform political culture in this country that is shared by the Tories, by Labour and by Reform, and to a lesser extent the Liberal Democrats as well. It's just all the same shit from every party. Just, oh well, we must do something about the fact that there are old people who already have a triple lock state pension who must have a winter fuel allowance as well, which again, I think they should continue to have, but it's the language and rhetoric that I care about here, whilst insisting that we must keep children in poverty that are unnecessarily there because of the 2-child cap on universal credit. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.